Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Nothing New Under the Sun, the history of education in America. We have Eric Myers, retired BGSU educator and administrator with us today to provide this information. So please welcome Eric.
Thank you. And I appreciate Julie and those who are here joining us on this beautiful day. I do have a PowerPoint with this, so I will get that open. And hopefully you can see that. And this is titled The History of Education in America, or Nothing New Under the Sun. And you'll understand why I say that as we get further along. The first thing that we have to talk about in the history of education is that the very first people who had education in America were the people who met Christopher Columbus when he landed here. As we all know, we were taught that Columbus discovered America, when in reality he thought he had discovered islands outside of India. Therefore, they were named the West Indies, and the name Indians came from that title, that they were people from India, which obviously was not accurate. But all of our kids are taught Columbus discovered America, when in reality, when he got here, there were millions of what you can call Native Americans already here. Approximately 10,000 years ago, folks came to America, to the North American hemisphere, by a land bridge into Alaska, and worked their way down, and eventually got all the way down to the end of South America. So when I asked my college students what was the first educational system in America, they're thinking about maybe the Puritans or something like that. They discount the fact that Native Americans had been educating their children, much like we are today, unfortunately, in the home. And that for many, many, many centuries, the children were educated by their mothers or their fathers in their home. The fathers training them how to survive in the world. What if they were a hunting group, how to hunt. If they were a farming group, how to farm. Where the mothers taught the children, the girls, all the jobs that females did in the Native American society. Obviously, there are hundreds and hundreds of tribes, but one thing that is similar is that they all educated in homeschooling. So when people talk about the new educational system of homeschooling, which has been around for less than a century officially, it actually has been around for about 10,000 years. We teach people in the United States based on a system that we got from England, and everything that we do in education comes from a Eurocentric approach, or it came from that's how they did it back in the old country in Europe. And the reason this occurred is that history, number one, is written by the winners, and the English and the other European countries in America defeated the Native Americans, and in reality wiped out many, many millions of them with disease. But anyway, we so-called liberated the country from Native Americans. There are those who will say we stole it. That's another topic. So our educational systems became Eurocentric. They became from Europe and how they did education in Europe. The American colonies were broken up into three major groups. First were the southern colonies, next were the middle colonies, and the third group was the northern colonies. And they all did things differently. The southern colonies were actually had a couple major cities, and those major cities at the time in the colonies were Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. They were the major ports, and that'll come back up in discussion here in a minute. But the southern colonies themselves were made up of huge plantations, and there were large farms that made crops such as rice, tobacco, cotton, to send back to England in these cases. Everything but Florida, which was Spanish, was settled by English folks. So we had these large farms, plantations that existed, and owned by very wealthy families, given the rights to those lands by the king or queen of England. It's kind of interesting that how families, or the male leader of the family who ran the plantation got the plantations. They were in England, in the wealthy families, the oldest son inherited everything. The second oldest son was, if they had a plantation in America, was given charge of that. So he had to take his family and move to America and the southern colonies and live on a plantation. The third son's usual choice was to go in the military or become a religious leader. And I have no idea what happened to the sons after that, but probably not anything that made their lives easier. So the plantations were huge amounts of land given by a king or queen, and these lands were farmed for crops to send back. If you've been to Charleston, South Carolina, there are many plantations around Charleston, and they're off the two rivers that come and meet in Charleston and go out into the ocean. And during the summer season, often the families left the plantations and came and lived in Charleston to get away from mosquitoes and the heat and humidity. These families had children, and these children needed to be educated, so they were given, they were educated in the home. There weren't community schools or groups that educated. They were done in the plantations because they were so large. So the folks had to have someone educate. And generally the father obviously was too busy running the plantation, and the mother was too busy with her duties of running the house. So they often brought over folks from England to tutor their children. And more often or not, these were folks that came over as indentured servants. And they were able to come over to America, or they had to come over to America, because in general, indentured servants were folks who were in debt back in England. And at that time, if you were in debt, you were put into a debtor's prison. So if they were educated, they were often offered 10-year contracts to come over to America. And a lot of these became tutors when they did that. There are those that have compared being an indentured servant to that of being a slave. And believe me, there was no comparison. The indentured servants got to live in the main house. They were treated well. They educated the children, often loved by the children, and they had more rights. The other folks in the South who were not educated at homeschooling were those that were slaves that were brought here from either Africa or South America. These were individuals, this was all part of an economic cycle where ships would leave England, go around the Horn in Africa, where they would pick up Africans who had been captured either by white hunters for slaves or by other tribes capturing people and bringing them in, putting them on the ship and receiving money for capturing them. Put in the ships then sailed to the West Indies, and sometimes they let out some of the slaves there, sometimes they picked up crops, and then they sailed with their shiploads to Richmond or Charleston, South Carolina. And from there, the slaves were unloaded and the crops that were grown on the plantations were put on the ships, and they sailed back to England. So you had many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals brought to our country who not only didn't want to come, but they couldn't speak the language. So it was, so the thought was, why not educate them? And these individuals did not receive education for several reasons. Number one is they were there to work on the farms, not to be educated. And secondly, there was great fear that there would be rebellion, because if they could communicate with each other through the written word, they could organize, and if they could organize, they could revolt. And because there were frequently many more slaves than there were English owners and families, they did not want these folks to organize and revolt. There were revolts that occurred. They were extremely bloody. If you want to know more about that, check out Nate Turner and his revolt that he led. Charleston, South Carolina is an example of this. I don't know if you've been to Charleston or not, but they have a market that runs about 3-4 blocks on, oddly enough, Market Street. And they say that slaves were not sold from there, but I kind of question that. They do send you to a spot where slaves were sold, which was about the size of a school classroom. And somehow I can't believe they ran 10,000, thousands and thousands of slaves through there. Some groups tried to educate the slaves, and one of those groups was called the English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. It was a missionary group to provide basic education so slaves could read the Bible. The one thing to keep in mind that in all formal education throughout the American colonies and early American states was that education's primary goal was to teach people to read the Bible. And it was often used as a school textbook. So groups like the English Society came over and tried to educate slaves. They were not well received. So the first kind of schooling in European style America would have been homeschooling by the rich and wealthy in the South. The middle colonies, and this is where I have fun with my class students as I ask them what colonies would be the middle colonies. And they're not great on geography, but the middle colonies are New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania. And these were all settled by a variety of religious groups. And that's the one thing that they all have in common, that they were plots of land, in most cases given by the king or the queen, in one case, to groups to settle. One quick word, America has been described as a melting pot. And a melting pot, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I'm very familiar with this concept. A melting pot is the molten steel after they have mixed in the iron ore and coke and the other uh, materials that make up steel. It's heated to a tremendously hot temperature until it's a liquid, and then it's poured into forms. And one of the steel mills near where I grew up, when you drove downtown on the Parkway, you could see in and you could see them pouring the molten steel coming through. So America has been described as a melting pot, where we take all kinds of folks and we put them together and we melt them and come out with an American. I think more of it as a tossed salad, where we have different groups and then we throw a salad dressing on top of Americanism, because we really don't take the backgrounds and ethnicities out of groups and melt them all together. We keep having individuals. So the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, as was drilled into me in Pennsylvania civics, was founded or was owned or given to William Penn, who was a member of the Friends Society, or more familiarly known to folks as Quakers. And they settled mostly starting out around Philadelphia and went west. Interestingly enough, when these colonies were given land, they were given it as far west as they could go. So potentially Pennsylvania, for example, could have gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So the first kinds of schools that in Pennsylvania were those that were run by the Friends Society or Quakers. You may remember that President Obama sent his two daughters to a Society of Friends high school, very prominent high school in Washington, D.C. Maryland, if you look at it, was settled by Catholics, and they were given their grant of land by Queen Mary. Therefore, the state became known as Maryland or Maryland. And the charter for that land was given to Lord Baltimore, so you have the city of Baltimore. And there, the Catholic schools set up their schools based on the Catholic Church, and where they had their dioceses and their smaller, broken down into different schools. So Maryland has a very strong parochial or Catholic school system there. So now we've reached, with the Quakers and with Catholic folks in Maryland, the first private schools in America, and these started in the 1700s, 1700s. New York was settled by the Dutch, by a group from Netherlands and the Dutch, and they were from the Dutch Anglican Church, which was very, very similar to the British Anglican Church. And if you'll remember your history way back when, they were bought by the folks came in and they bought the island of Manhattan for about 26 bucks worth of shiny objects and things. And I joke, you can't even park your car now for 26 bucks on Manhattan. So that was perhaps the greatest real estate deal in the world for rich land. The Dutch Anglican, if you are familiar with the name Stuyvesant, Peter Stuyvesant, there are parts of New York that have very Dutch sounding names. And they also had parochial schools. Other groups were Delaware, which was certainly in the news this past week, and New Jersey. And I don't know much about New Jersey. I just know growing up in Pittsburgh, I thought that New Jersey was a huge paved parking lot. And much to my surprise, when I went there to go to the National Scouting headquarters when I was around 20, was the fact that there's a lot of farmland and a very beautiful state. But it also was settled, I presume, having to do with the Isle of Jersey, and they also had private schools. the northern colonies, which would be such as Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, were all settled by the Puritans. And the Puritans came, you're all familiar, since Thanksgiving's coming up, you're all familiar with the Puritans coming, and they settled in Plymouth, where they landed, and they settled and eventually created Boston. And they were the first group to have modern public schools. They, as populations in the town grew, they had a law that said that every town with more than 50 families shall appoint someone to teach all the children. This was called the Old Diluter Satan Act. Diluter, if any of you are into science, know that if you want to dilute an acid, you want to water it down or weaken it. Well, the Old Diluter Satan Act, they wanted to weaken Satan. And you do that by teaching people to read the Bible. So they created schools. And as soon as you had 50 families, you had to appoint someone to teach the children. Invariably, it was a single woman who could read and write was appointed to teach. And generally, it was one that they designated as someone not likely to get married. So if they were, my classes are always amazed when I ask all the females in class over the age of 18 who are single to raise your hand, and most of them raise their hand. I said, well, you are now officially too old to get married, so you would have been a teacher. And your hopes of getting married were pretty much gone at that point in time. They're not very happy with that. So you had classes, and they basically read the Bible, and that was their basic textbook, and they had some other things that you've all seen, but they were the public schools. And in New England, whenever a town got too big, branches would break off and go and set up another town nearby. If you've ever been to Massachusetts, you know you can't go more than 10 miles without tripping over a town. And that's because they spread out like they did. So in colonial America, you had, first of all, you had homeschooling, which Native Americans practiced, and then the folks in the South. You had private schools, predominantly religious schools in the middle colonies, and then public schooling in New England and northern America, and then these spread west. Some of the unusual things that occurred in education, one that occurred was what was called a Monitorial School, and this was founded in 1805. And this was a result of the Industrial Revolution, which started in the late 1700s, and the theory that efficiency came into the production world. And just like today, you will occasionally hear people say schools should be run more like businesses. Someone had the brilliant idea that you could get a whole bunch of kids in one room and teach them all at once, then you wouldn't need so many teachers. So they came up with this great idea of a monitorial school. And they put students in a huge room, and they were grades 1 through 6. And then they had one teacher teaching up the hundreds of kids, and they used the 6th grade girls to work with students individually. So this was what was called a monitorial school, because you monitor their learning in large groups. And and the question is, does it still exist? And the answer is, if you've taken any basic course at a large university, you've been stuck in a large lecture hall. BGSU, Olds Camp has 3 or 4 of the lecture halls. Education building has one, where you put 100 kids in and we teach them. So that the concept still exists. But this started back as an answer to the Industrial Revolution. Fortunately, we don't do that anymore. Class sizes now maybe are anywhere from 20 to 40, depending on where you are, which is at least more manageable than several hundred. Elementary schools were the first public schools that existed up until probably the start of the 20th century. Most education, common education, were grades 1 through 8. And then folks would quit to go on and participate in education. If they went on after grade 8, they were generally wealthy and were going to private schools, and I'll talk about those, or public schools that were specific. I don't have it in front of me, but I have the requirements to get into Harvard and Yale. And invariably they were, you had to be able to discuss the theories of Tully, who was a Roman philosopher. You had to be able to speak Greek and read Greek and Latin. You had to have some ability to do math, and you had to be male, and you had to be Christian. And those were the requirements to get into Harvard and Yale. So obviously only the wealthy moved on to college. Probably one of the most common names for schools in America is the Horace Mann schools. Horace was the Secretary of the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. And I can tell you the most good and innovative things in education in America for a long time came out of Massachusetts. Horace Mann was one of these who helped that. He helped develop kindergarten. And if you want to look for wacky ideas, look at California. I have a student this semester from California, and she just cracked up laughing when I said that, and all she said was, "That is so true." So good ideas in education have come from Massachusetts. Maybe a little strange ones have come from California. In 1852, Massachusetts passed a compulsory education law, and by 1900, 32 other states had passed similar laws. The states that did not have compulsory education at this point in time, again, there were not 50 states at that point in time, but there were states that did not have compulsory education. They were predominantly in the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, did not have, Tennessee did not have compulsory education laws because they, at that point in time, the segregation still existed, and they did not want to provide as much education as they could for African Americans or the freed slaves. So they did not require that they stayed in school, and most of them obviously did not because they needed to work. The compulsory education again came from Massachusetts before Civil War, and again it was generally grades 1 through 8. But soon after that, secondary schools started to spring in. There's a major court case, it's called the Kalamazoo case, where their school board set up a high school, and this is back in like I forget the date exactly, but somewhere around 1860s, 70s. They set up a high school, and they passed a tax on people to pay for that high school. And it did not get outside of Michigan, did not go to the Supreme Court, but they found in favor of the schools, and this allowed schools throughout the country, school districts, to start taxing citizens for high school. First high schools in America include the Latin Grammar School. First one was in 1635, and again it taught Latin and classical subjects as in Greek, and it was to prepare the students to either go to Harvard, Yale, or to go back to England. The better, richer students went back to England. The less rich went to Harvard or Yale, which is, they probably don't like admitting that at this point. One of the things that amazes me is when I ask my students who Ben Franklin was, and there's usually silence. And then I mention something about electricity, and they said, "Oh yeah, he invented electricity." And they said, "Well, I don't think he invented it." But I talked about the fact that he put a key on a kite, put it up in a thunderstorm, and it got hit by lightning. And he had a wire running to it. To show the intelligence of Ben Franklin, he didn't hold the wire, he had some kid hold it. So the kid got the shock off of the lightning hitting the key. Ben Franklin did a whole bunch of other stuff you all know about. I believe he created false teeth for George Washington. He's responsible for libraries. He's responsible for fire stations, a whole bunch of things. He was somewhat of a questionable individual, having to do with his morals and his liking of the opposite sex, but he did many, many things for our country. He was truly a Renaissance man. One of the things he did was he created the American Academy, which was created because Latin grammar schools were not providing a safe education, a practical education for students. And he even did the rare thing as he allowed females to attend, unheard of at that point in time. Any education that females received that wasn't by their mothers was done by tutors in the home and not in schools. But this was the start of vocational education. High schools started in 1821, was the English Classical School, later the English High School. There is an English school in Charleston that still exists, although it's now private. It was established because most people could not afford to send their children to private academies, so it was the first public schools. One of the interesting things in education that has occurred is that in 1910, they founded the first junior highs. And the history behind this is sort of interesting. They all of a sudden realized, as I'm sure all of you realize, that when you get kids that are 12, 13, or 14, they're not like anybody else. Okay? They're not certainly like kids in grades 1 through 6, and they certainly don't have the maturity of high school kids. And so the folks decided they had to do something to educate people. So they had to decide how to do this. And the question was, do you educate them like elementary, or do you educate them like high schools? And they decided that they should be educated like high school. So I don't know about you folks, but when I was in junior high, we were on the basement of our high school, and we followed the high school schedule, and we went from class to class to class. The only difference was we were smaller, and that's why junior high schools are named junior high schools, because they are truly junior high schools. They were like little high schools for junior high kids. In 1916, in 36 states, there were only 54 junior high schools. Around the 1950s, a new concept started, and they are called middle schools. And imagine some of you are familiar with middle schools. They're the same grades. They're no different. Bowling Green's middle school is 6, 7, and 8. But the difference is a philosophy on how you handle students. And the main difference between how you handle students is that if you have, let's say you have 300 kids in a grade, they would divide that into maybe 4 teams. So each team would have 75 students. And those students would take those 75 would take all their academic, English, math, social studies, science classes with the same 4 teachers. So those 75 would switch class periods. And then you would have like pods. So a middle school would have, for each grade, and numbers vary, and they can go up to 120 in each team. But the consistency is those 75 kids have the same 4 academic teachers. And the reason that they did this was a way to look after kids so they don't get lost. Because where you start to lose kids academically in schooling is in the junior high. It's not the high school so much as it is at the middle or junior high school. So each of those teams, the teachers have a teaming period, and they get together and they talk about kids and who's having problems or who's doing well, and they immediately can call the parents from that. So that's the difference between a junior high and a middle school. Middle schools were the rage. For a while, recently, Bowling Green built their new middle school, and it's set up with wings for each grade, and they have different pods with their math, science, social studies, and English classes together for their team. And then they may have their academics in the morning, and in the afternoon they have their other classes like phys ed and stuff like that. So those were the middle school is what it is. Toledo built all kinds of new middle schools, and then recently decided to go back to a K-8 system. So for a lot of their schools, they no longer have middle schools. They have K-8 programs even after they went and built buildings for it. So those are different kinds of secondary schools that exist. A couple quick things. Most states have a minimum age where you can quit. And in Ohio, it's graduation. And so, for example, I graduated from high school when I was 17. So, the mandatory age is 18 in Ohio unless you graduate. However, as you well know, there are many different ways to get there, and no longer do you have to be enrolled in a public school. In an earlier session, I talked about the different kinds of schooling, and those types of schooling, homeschooling, you can get a GED, which is a general education degree or diploma. It's typically had been set at difficulty of the level of 9th grade. Now I think they've toughened it up since then, and I think they've raised the age on it. At one point, they didn't have a minimum age, and 2 students from Toledo who were 14 got their GEDs. And then unfortunately, they stole a car and got in all kinds of trouble after they had their GED, and that led to the state raising the age on the GED classes. So the history of education in America, the subtitle for this is Nothing New Under the Sun. Homeschooling is a very popular item, and in today's world, even with public schools, homeschooling is a predominant thing. And saw today in today's news that Toledo public schools are closing again, and they're going back to the learning online from the home, which any of the parents that have had to deal with this or grandparents can guarantee you that that's very much a homeschooling system. The work may be provided, but they have to help and do a whole lot for that. Private schools, which originally started in America pretty much in the middle colonies or middle states, and then public schooling, which started in New England. So that's a very, very quick and not particularly deep view of education and the history of education in America. If you remember anything from this, it's you ought to learn that other than online computer learning, which obviously is pretty new, everything else has been around in America for centuries and centuries. So that's all that I have on that topic, and I will stop the share and answer any questions that you have, Danielle. I don't know if you...
Perfect, Eric. Thank you so much. I'm just going to stop the recording.